I have a confession to make. I don't share my faith as much as I did prior to becoming a pastor. Now, for some of you, that may come as a bit of a surprise, particularly if you're somebody whose only real contact with me comes on a Sunday morning. Because anytime you hear me talk, I'm talking about Jesus. You're going to be thinking, well, if what he said is true, then he must have been an absolute religious fanatic prior to being ordained. Well, I wasn't, or at least I didn't think I was. But I did share my faith a lot back then, and certainly more then than I do now, at least among people who weren't believers. Of course, I do share my faith lots now with churchgoers, people who are already disciples of Jesus. But having faith conversations with others seems to have gone way, way down. When I was a teenager, I can remember being at work, and there would be conversations that would come up with people at work. When I was at university, I would look for opportunities where I could say something. Sometimes I would even just drop a little hint. Someone would ask me, "How was your weekend?" And I would say it was good. And I would say, they'd ask what you did, and so I say, "Oh, I went to church, went to my youth group," and often that would start a conversation between me and somebody else. I can remember traveling through Europe when I was in seminary, and I was traveling with some friends. And numerous times there were opportunities where I was chatting with somebody and we started to talk about things of faith. Back then, there were lots of opportunities, but since becoming a pastor, opportunities have gone way, way down. And I've tried to reflect on why. Have I changed? I mean, do I give off some kind of holier than thou kind of vibe and people just decide to stay away from me? Or has society changed? Are people in society less open today to things of faith than they once were? Now, if you were to look at statistics of the number of people who go to church, you would see that in recent years, the numbers have gone way down. A couple months ago, there was a report in the Anglican Journal, if you happen to see that, and it was talking about the state of the church and the possibility that the church could cease to exist by the year 2040 because numbers were on the decline. In many churches, amongst many denominations, they haven't been experiencing growth. But instead, they've been experiencing quite the opposite. I was reading a poll, and it said that back in 1971, only 4% of Canadians would have said that they were religiously unaffiliated. By 2011, that number had risen from 4% up to 24%. So we might get the sense that faith is diminishing. People might look at stats and conclude that society has indeed changed. And they might say that because society has changed, it's just natural that conversations are going to decrease as well, because people just aren't interested. And yet I remember my eyes opening to a real spiritual hunger that I noticed a few years back. I was in the States. I was in Seattle, and I was taking a course there. And we went into an Anglican church one evening, and it was a big, old, stone-looking church, large building. And they were having a service of evening prayer. And that church was packed. I would say probably about 400 people. And they were all young people in their late teens, early 20s. There were so many people that people were having to sit on the floor. They'd bring some blankets so the floor wasn't so cold. And they just sat on the floor and they worshiped in that church. Obviously, they were searching for something. You know, I was reading another poll the other day, and it seems to back up that sense of spiritual hunger in the world. Angus Reid poll done a couple of years ago, and it revealed that Canada is far from the religiously closed society that many people might have thought it to be. While church attendance has been declining, the number of people who are open to things of faith is actually considerably high. Only 27% of those who responded in this poll identified themselves as being closed to things religious or spiritual. Now, if I do my math correctly, that leaves 73% who are open at least to some extent. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be going to church. Doesn't mean that they're going to be looking towards faith like you or I might do. But they're open to something. Of those 73%, there are some that would call themselves religious and spiritual. There were some who would call themselves religious but not particularly spiritual. And there are some that would say that they were spiritual but not religious. Now, I don't know whether those kind of terms really connect with you or not. We might not be drawn to such descriptions. But I think it points out to the reality that in our world, there is far more openness to things of a spiritual nature than many of us might have expected. I think too many of us simply assume that nobody is going to be interested. Well, we've kind of set things up as though it's us against the world. When I think of the decline in me of faith conversations with people who aren't yet followers of Jesus, I think it's probably because of the company I keep. My circles are mostly around people of church, and it's not so much amongst people outside these walls. And yet, as our church buildings remain closed, as church becomes much more focused on being church in the world, being a church without walls, I wonder whether there may be even more opportunities for conversations with others who might cross paths with us. And I don't just mean that for me, I mean that for each and every one of us. I wonder if we might be able to have an impact as we live as the church wherever we are. You know, in our first reading today, we heard the witness of Paul, how he went about things in what may have seemed like a fairly hostile world. I want us to explore that passage today. Open ourselves up to hear what God might be saying to us. And I want to title the sermon today, Sharing Jesus 101. Now, just so we understand who Paul is, for those of you who may be unfamiliar with some of the story, Paul was formerly known as Saul, and he was a Pharisee amongst the Jewish people. And he was actually somebody who was opposed to the Christian faith. He didn't actually become a Christian until after Jesus' death and resurrection. He went about persecuting Christians in his early years, until one day on a road to Damascus, as he was en route to go and arrest more Christians, he met with the risen Christ, and he became a follower of Jesus. Now, when I think about Paul and what he might have been like shortly after his conversion, you might think that it would have been very tempting for him to just simply get together with other like-minded people. That newfound Christian community, that he might just get together with them and make up for lost time that he'd been outside of that community. You know, for some Christians today, they limit themselves, they limit the people who they have interaction with. There are some people who will only have Christians as their friends. They kind of live in some kind of holy huddle, just surround themselves with like-minded people. I'm sure you've heard stories, sad stories, about people who have immune deficiencies and some people having to live in bubbles to protect themselves. Well, sometimes there's Christians who almost live like that. They isolate themselves in some kind of Christian bubble because they're afraid of being contaminated by others. You know, there are some people who, once they become followers of Jesus, they want to leave the past behind, all the influences of the past. And so they steer well away. And for some people, perhaps for the first little bit, it's right that they do that. They might need to have a little bit of separation so they don't slide back into familiar patterns. But those people, many of those people, they seem to get comfortable in that isolated living, and they never want to leave. There are others who perhaps aren't trying to leave something behind, but they just still feel far more comfortable when they're with people who think like they think. They just find a kind of a protected life with other believers, and they just set up their home and their roots there. But, you know, if you look at the life of Jesus, where was Jesus typically found? Well, I mean, one of the biggest issues that many of the religious leaders had about Jesus during his life and ministry was that Jesus hung around with sinners too much of the time. People outside of the faith community. People like to resort to a holy huddle, a religious bubble. And, you know, those people, I think they give off a holier than thou kind of vibe. There's some Christians that seem to be more judgmental than anybody else around them. It's interesting to note that when Paul first became a disciple or an apprentice of Jesus, he didn't cut himself off from others. While he did spend some time with believers, it didn't take long before he ventured out. He wanted to engage with people in the world. And his greatest desire was to share the good news of Jesus. As we look at our reading today, there are things that stand out with regards to how Paul went about his life as an apostle of Jesus. One of the first things that we notice is that Paul was a student of the world. Our passage spoke about conversation that Paul had with the people in Athens at the Areopagus. Now, that was a place that people would come together and they would share ideas. Might relate it to kind of like the Facebook of the ancient world, perhaps. People would share some of their ideas. They'd come together and they would say what was on their mind. And so there would be this back and forth. Whenever a new idea came, then people would gather. Well, Paul was given the opportunity to speak at the Areopagus. And the thing that struck me that before Paul even spoke to the people in that place, it was clear that Paul had been studying the world. If you look at verses 22 and 23 of Acts 17, it says this: Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus, and he said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.'" Now, did Paul know ahead of time that he was going to get an opportunity to speak at the Areopagus? We don't know. I doubt that it was just open to anybody. I don't think it was like buskers signing up to play at the farmer's market. They just get a time slot and then they're on. I think probably it was certain people that would be getting this opportunity, but Paul, he got this opportunity. Likely, when he was going through Athens, he didn't know he was going to get that opportunity. But even so, he was keeping his eyes open as he was walking around the city of Athens. As he went around, he noticed things. He was aware of what people were thinking. By walking around with his eyes open and being a student of that area, he was able to see what was important to people. And as Paul did that, he noticed that there was an openness to things spiritual. There were statues to gods all over the place. Likely that there were little name plates beneath each statue, so people would know who it was meant to be. And there was even an altar ascribed to the unknown God. And so it seems as though the people of Athens, they were determined to cover their bases. They named as many gods as they possibly could think of, and they made one more inscription, just in case they'd forgotten one. For them, it was kind of like perhaps a religious insurance policy. As Paul walked around Athens, he noticed it all. And the thing is, he looked at things through the lens of his own relationship with Jesus. Paul was a student of his surroundings. He learned what was important to the people in that place. He tried to understand it all in relation to his faith. You know, if we are going to have any impact in the world for the sake of Jesus, we need to be students of the world. We need to keep our eyes open. We need to keep our finger on the pulse of society. Make ourselves aware of what's important to the people around us. As we discover what's important to them and we connect with the people on those things that are important to them, so will we discover that there will be opportunities for us to have conversations with those people. Let's keep going. What else did Paul see as being important as he sought to share his faith? Well, the next thing that strikes me is that Paul had a generosity of spirit. If you look at how Paul goes about things, you notice that he didn't go into the conversation with the people of Athens all guns blazing. He doesn't go wagging his finger at them and tell them how wrong they are and tell them that they'd better get their lives together and their acts together before they go to hell. No, instead, he looks for common ground. And he approaches the conversation in a spirit of generosity. Remember what Paul had seen as he'd wandered through the city of Athens. He'd seen objects of worship all over that city. Now, those objects of worship weren't for Christian worship. And as he walked around the city, it may well have made him feel a bit uncomfortable as he saw those different statues to the different gods. I mean, if you think of the 10 Commandments, first commandment, I am the Lord your God, you'll have no other gods before me. Second commandment, you'll have no graven images. I mean, as Paul thought about that, he would have realized that, the people of Athens, they were 0 for 2 on the very first 2 commandments. Now, some people would have approached the conversation quite differently. They would have told the Athenians that they were on the road to destruction. And yet, if you notice what Paul did, that's not how he started. Verse 22, people of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. Paul opened in a spirit of generosity. Paul looked for common ground that they shared together, rather than looking for the things that separated them. He looked for ways in which they were similar, rather than looking for ways in which they were different. Sadly, this is not the approach many people take when it comes to sharing faith. People who approach sharing a faith, they often see it as kind of an argument that they need to win. They want to point out how other people are wrong and how people need to see things their way. And yet, if you look at the life and ministry of Jesus, you see a generosity of spirit. If you look at the times when Jesus was critical, you notice that Jesus was critical to those who were amongst the religious leaders of the day, those who were already amongst the religious people. They were the ones who thought they knew it all. They knew better than everybody else. There were people who set up walls of division as opposed to building bridges. You know, whenever Jesus met people who were more on the periphery, we see a gentleness and a generosity of spirit. That's not always what we see from people today who claim to be followers of Jesus. I remember reading this quote from Mahatma Gandhi, who said, "I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. Your Christians are so unlike your Christ." If we're going to get any opportunity to enter into faith conversations with others, if we're ever going to get the chance to engage in dialogue with any of the people in the world who are among the spiritually open, we've got to be known as people of generosity. We've got to be people who look for common ground with those around us. We've got to be looking to build bridges rather than building walls or fences. You know, prior to becoming an apprentice of Jesus, Paul wasn't somebody who was particularly generous. I talked about how he would go and arrest people who were following the faith. But when Paul met with Jesus on that road to Damascus, he changed from the inside out. He became somebody who had a heart for the people around him. He still knew what he believed. It wasn't that his faith became wishy-washy. It wasn't that he didn't think he had something important to share. In fact, quite the opposite. He thought his faith was so important that he knew if he was ever going to get an opportunity to share it, he needed to be building bridges. So he looked for common ground with the people around him, entered into conversations with a spirit of generosity. He noticed he had the things that he had in common with others, and he used those things as a starting point so that he could share a relationship with them, build a relationship with them, and share Jesus with the people. One more thing that I want us to be looking at today, and it has to do with the content of Paul's message. For Paul, it was all about relationship. If you look at what Paul said to the people there in Athens, at the Areopagus, you'll notice that Paul didn't spend time trying to argue theology. He didn't try to convince his listeners of the validity of the Trinity. He didn't invite people into a Bible study and say, it says this here, so you better believe it. No, Paul had a whole different approach, and it had to do with relationship. And that had only become important to him because of the relationship that he already knew that he had with God through the person of Jesus. Remember how things were prior to Saul's conversion. He believed that he was a follower of God. He believed that he knew God. And yet when the risen Jesus met him on that Damascus road and he spoke out to him, remember Saul's first words? "Who are you, Lord?" It was at that point that Saul met the risen Jesus. It was at that point that Saul really came to know God, because God's word had become flesh. God had taken on human form so people could come to know God. It was all about relationship. As Paul entered into conversation with the people of Athens, so was his desire to speak about relationship. Remember Paul's words to the people. I love the way that the Living Bible puts it. He said, "Men of Athens, I notice that you are very religious. For I was out walking and I saw many altars, and one of them had this inscription on it, 'To the unknown God.' You have been worshiping him without knowing who he is. And now I wish to tell you about him." In the Message, verse 23 has it this way: "I'm here to introduce you to this God. so that you can worship intelligently. Know who you're dealing with. For Paul, it was all about relationship. And for him, it was really about two kinds of relationship. First and foremost, it was about relationship with God, but also vitally important to Paul was relationship with the people that he was trying to reach. We don't see it as obvious here, but in other places, many times you see Paul building up relationships with people, spending great deals of time with people so that he can get to know them, they can have a relationship between them, and so that he can then reflect Jesus to them. Paul wasn't a kind of like a hit and run kind of evangelist, just hit them with the message and then leave town and go somewhere else. No, Paul was somebody who nurtured relationships. He nurtured with them, with the people, so that he could reach them, so they could catch a real glimpse of who Jesus was and is through him. I just want to say, since we've started live streaming our services, I don't know all who are watching and listening to this service right now. Many of you may have been coming to this church or another church for years. Some of you maybe have never even set foot in a church before. And there was just something that drew you to an online service. Regardless of who you are and regardless of what your background is, I want to say to each and every one, this faith stuff here, it's not primarily about doctrine. It's not primarily about what people do and don't do. It's not even primarily about what people believe. What this is primarily about is relationship. The fact that the God who made the world wants to have a relationship with us. This is about entering into a relationship with God, getting to know the one who made us, the one who loves us, the one who would not hold himself back from us in any way. This is about relationship. And I believe that as we seek to grow in that relationship with Jesus, and as we take hold of the fact that this is about relationship, and as we engage in the relationships with people around us, I think we're going to find far more people willing to engage in conversation, perhaps than we've ever really thought possible. As people really get to know us, and they see in us a spirit of generosity, I think they're going to be much more open to the things that we long to share. Sadly, too many people have gotten the impression from others that this faith stuff is about the do's and the don'ts, the rights and the wrongs. It's all about theological bullet points, but it's not. It's all about relationship with God through Jesus. And the sense I have of our world today is that people are longing for relationship. And I wonder when this pandemic is over, whether there's even going to be a deeper longing for relationship. Will we be ready? Will we have something worthwhile to say? May we become students of our world, making ourselves aware of what people around us are thinking. May we live lives in a spirit of generosity, seeking to build bridges rather than walls. And may our faith be all about relationship with Jesus and with the people that we meet, that they might hear Jesus call their name, and they then might take the next step in becoming disciples of him. Let's bow our heads. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your love for us. We thank you for your radical generosity in allowing Jesus to come to live amongst us, the Word made flesh. That you want to build a relationship with us. Lord, help us to enter into that relationship more fully. Help us to engage in the people around us, building up relationships with those as we reflect you, as we share you. We just pray, Lord, that people will come to know your unfailing love. We ask these things in the precious name of Jesus. Amen.